Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Lee. It's not just a formula, it really is a pleasure and an honor to be honoring two great American artists under the auspices of the PSA, which helped do that favorite poem project, those videos, and Poets House. Nice simple name for an organization, Poets House. It's in the spirit of Frost and Williams. I chose this topic partly because these two artists sometimes seem to represent opposites. And I think in all the important ways as artists and as people, they have a lot in common. The two things they have in common that I'll try to focus on are in relation to America, our culture, our politics, our society. That's one thing they think they share. And another is to do with the physical material of the art of poetry. Robert Frost and William Carlos Williams were not complacent about the United States of America. They found it an energizing and agonistic process to be an American. They reflected on it often, and they did not, for the most part, reflect upon it in a way that was complacent. That, in my mind, is related to the other thing I want to talk to you about, which is an attitude towards art, particularly the art of poetry. In my sense of art, a work of art gives some of the attributes of the human soul to something that is material, something made out of glass or wood or pigments or musical sounds vibrating in the air or human bodies dancing or walking around and talking to one another in a play. Some of you have heard me say before that, in my opinion, the medium for poetry is not words. The medium in this sense must be something material. It is a vocal art. Some of you have heard me before hurry to say it is vocal but not necessarily performative. Williams and Frost wrote for what I think is the true medium of a poem, the reader's body. That is, the reader's voice. Your breath is the medium, in my opinion, for Emily Dickinson, for Allen Ginsberg, for William Shakespeare, for whoever wrote the poem. And these two writers understood that. I believe there is something of a fake crisis in American poetry, something that is said to be a crisis that is not a crisis. And it overlays and distracts from what seems to me a significant, important, ongoing, historic issue in the real culture of the United States itself. This will be a very brief digression before I read Frost and Williams to you. And they are germane to it. The fake crisis is, oh, we have to make poetry more jovial and genial and friendly and easy, and it's gotten too gloomy and difficult and critical and weird. It should be more like something you can hum. It should be chummier. It shouldn't be so hard. Randall Jarrell, thinking about this, Jarrell talks about the people who say, I don't get modern poetry, as though to imply that what they like to do in the evening is curl up with Paradise Lost. I think this, it sounds plausible. There's the idea that the lyric, well, it's a lyre. So shouldn't poetry be somebody strumming and entertaining people while they chew venison or eat pot roast or something? Ezra Pound was so infuriated by this that he wrote a piece called The Endless Preaching to the Mob. I think the lyre is a good symbol of what poetry is. It's portable, it's relatively small, it's played by one person, and unlike a tragic chorus or an epic poem, it's on a human scale. It doesn't take place in an altar of a god. And it's an instrument that lets you use your voice. So that lyric poetry has two things. I have an instrument, and I have a voice. The instrument I didn't invent, I got it from somewhere. Call it civilization or poetry or a poem by someone. And I give voice. This to me is the dialectic of poems as different as The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot and Howl by Allen Ginsberg. In both cases, the poet says, here's this instrument. Words like Moloch, words like Shanti, the whole history of my language, the whole history of poetry. Is it my instrument, or is it going to kill me or destroy me? Or that's the modernist part. What is my relation to it? And before I close, I hope I will read to you poems that seem to be in that tradition of the lyric as involving this instrument and the voice. I'll try to give voice to a couple of poems on a theme by each of these poets. First, I'll read love poems to you. To Earthward. Love at the lips was touch as sweet as I could bear, and once that seemed too much, I lived on air that crossed me from sweet things, the flow of, was it musk from hidden grapevine springs downhill at dusk? I had the swirl and ache from sprays of honeysuckle that when they're gathered shake dew on the knuckle. I crave strong sweets, but those seemed strong when I was young, the petal of the rose that stung. Now, no joy, but lacks salt that is not dashed with pain and weariness and fault. I crave the stain of tears, the aftermark of almost too much love, the sweet of bitter bark and burning clove. When stiff and sore and scarred, I take away my hand from leaning on it hard in grass and sand. The hurt is not enough. I long for weight and strength to feel the earth as rough to all my length. Love song. I lie here thinking of you. The stain of love is upon the world. Yellow, yellow, yellow. It eats into the leaves, smears with saffron the horned branches that lean heavily against a smooth purple sky. There is no light, only a honey-thick stain that drips from leaf to leaf and limb to limb, spoiling the colors of the whole world. You far off there, under the wine-red selvage of the West. We often use the expression music in talking about poetry. By we, I mean my friends and me. And sometimes you think it's almost an archaic art form. This thing of writing something that will sound good in anybody's voice at all. You're not writing it for Sir John Gielgud to read, and a wonderful actor to read. You're not writing it for a skilled rap artist to read, or for yourself, the poet with a wonderful personality. You're writing it for anybody who all says, love at the lips was touch as sweet as I could bear, and once that seemed too much, I lived on air that crossed me from, what flow was it, musk? Anybody at all can hear it because of the way the vowels and the consonants are arranged. It would be possible to read To Earthward naively and lose the sound of the sentence. I had the swirl and ache from sprays of honeysuckle that when they're gathered shake dew on the knuckle. Really great stanza. 4 lines, 2 rhymes. I had this swirl and ache from sprays of honeysuckle that when they're gathered shake dew on the knuckle. You could lose the sound of the sentence. You could say, I had this swirl and ache from sprays of honeysuckle that when they're gathered shake dew on the knuckle. It's inferior because it gives less information. You could also lose the sound of the formal principle and read only the sentence. I had the swirl and ache from sprays of honeysuckle, though when they're gathered, shake dew on the knuckle. So there's the naive reading emphasizes the form. There's the hammy reading that emphasizes the sentence sound. And the artist, I believe, is trying to help you to hear, I had the swirl and ache from sprays of honeysuckle when they're gathered shake dew on the knuckle. That tension between the sentence sound and the line, sometimes coming together, stiff and sore and scarred. I take away my hand from leaning on it hard in grass and sand, and sometimes pulling against one another. I lived on air that crossed me from sweet things. The flow of, was it musk from hidden? You can feel the reaching in the relationship between the sentence and the line. That is the art. And it equally is in love song. I lie here thinking of you. I lie here thinking of you. Hear and think have the same vowel, and it's part of the art of the poem. I lie here thinking of you. The stain of love is upon the world. The stain of love is upon the world. Yellow, yellow, yellow. It eats into the leaves, smears with saffron the horned branches that lean heavily against the smooth purple sky. There is no light, only a honey-thick stain that drips from leaf to leaf and limb to limb, spoiling the colors of the whole world. You far off there, under the wine-red selvage of the West. The wine-red selvage of the West. Selvage has got to do with the edge of material, where it's not hemmed or sewn across. It's rough. You far off there, under the wine-red selvage of the West. That short eval, red selvage West, resolves the poem as surely as I lie here thinking of you, begins it. And again, I suppose you could naively lose the sentence sounds. I lie here thinking of you, the stain of love is upon the world. Yellow, yellow, yellow. It eats into the leaves, smears with saffron, the horned branches that lean heavily. Again, you're giving less of the information. And both of these artists knew how to guide you through the sounds of a poem by having both kinds of information, the sound of the sentence and the nature of the form. This is famously associated with Frost in those letters to John Bartlett, where he says this, I'll tell you, give a new definition of a sentence. A sentence is a sound on which other sounds are strung. And he gives that wonderful example of sentences you could hear through a closed door, and you'd hear the shape of them. You mean to tell me you can't read? Ready, set, go. This is from Williams' author's introduction. Prose may carry a load of ill-defined matter like a ship, but poetry is the machine which drives it, pruned to a perfect economy. As in all machines, its movement is intrinsic, undulant, of physical more than a literary character. Of physical more than a literary character. In a poem, this movement is distinguished in each case by the character of the speech from which it arises. And a little further, it isn't what he says that counts in a work of art. It's what he makes with such intensity of perception that it lives with an intrinsic movement of its own to verify the authenticity. And what I'm talking about to you tonight, in a way, is movement. And the movement, in both cases, expresses a straining against the inherited, let's call it the instrument, of all love poetry. Frost says, Now no joy but lacks salt that is not dashed with pain and weariness and fault. I crave the stain of tears, the aftermark of almost too much love, the sweet of bitter bark and burning clove, when stiff and sore and scarred. And really that exquisiteness, almost a perversity, almost a kind of grotesque sensuality, is there in both halves of the poem when he says, and once that seemed too much, I lived on air that crossed me from sweet things, the flow of, was it musk from hidden grapevine spring? He's almost parodying his own sensitivity. I crave song sweets, but those seemed strong when I was young. The petal of the rose it was that stung. And in that word order, the petal of the rose it was that stung. I hear Frost partly smiling at or in tension with. He's somewhat criticizing his own maybe 1890s-ish exquisiteness, the slightest sensation. He's parodying his own sensitivity. The physical material of the poem gives the poem movement that is the major part of its meaning. Similarly, Williams about the colors of the world being ruined by the honey, the sexual honey of the yellow leaves dripping from tree to tree. Here are two poems about work. Fine work with pitch and copper. Now they are resting in the fleckless light separately in unison like the sacks of sifted stones stacked regularly by twos about the flat roof, ready after lunch to be opened and strewn. The copper in 8-foot strips has been beaten lengthwise down the center at right angles and lies ready to edge the coping. One still chewing picks up a copper strip and runs his eye along it. No villanelle or sonnet could be more formal or more musical than this poem of Williams that in a way feels casual. It feels like you may have read that he kept a typewriter with paper in it in his doctor's office, and between appointments he'd hammer out a poem. It feels so casual, it feels almost like he could have been looking from the office window to the roof next door and see guys who are doing roofing. Listen to the vowels and consonants. Now they are resting in the fleckless light. Now they are resting in the fleckless light, separately in unison, like the sacks of sifted stones stacked regularly by twos. And twos becomes like a new character in a play or a novel, that ooh sound. Now they are resting in the fleckless light separately. All three first lines have that shorty. Now they're resting in the fleckless light separately in unison like the sacks of sifted stones stacked regularly by twos about the flat roof, ready after lunch to be opened and strewn. In twos about the flat roof, ready after lunch to be opened and strewn. It may be rhyme in a sort of jazzy way, but it's at least as rich in rhyme as the poem by Frost. And this bravura showing off, second half of the poem. The copper in 8-foot strips has been beaten lengthwise down the center at right angles and lies ready to edge the coping. One still chewing picks up a copper strip and runs his eye along it. Like the observation of work, somebody might look at something, the luxury of looking at your work before you start it again while you're still chewing. He clearly is also telling us about what he has just done. He has run his eye along that scene, doing his work. Frost's poem also, I think, associates the work of the poet with the physical work. Mowing. There is never a sound beside the wood but one, and that was my long scythe whispering to the ground. What was it whispered? I knew not well myself. Perhaps it was something about the heat of the sun, something perhaps about the lack of sound, and that was why it whispered and did not speak. It was no dream of the gift of idle hours or easy gold at the hand of fay or elf. Anything more than the truth would have seemed too weak to the earnest love that laid this swale in rows, not without feeble-pointed spikes of flowers, pale orchises, and scared a bright green snake. The fact is the sweetest dream that labor knows. My long scythe whispered and left the hay to make. I submit to you that Williams could have used the Frost line as an epigraph for his poem about the roofers. The fact is the sweetest dream that labor knows. The mystery and tension in love, the mystery and tension in work. Part of the purpose of writing the poem is that you not understand. To tell you, you don't understand everything about the fascination and attractiveness of work. And indeed, the instrument of poetry, when you give voice to write a poem, or when you give voice to Williams's poem, is mysterious. What could be less poetic than the copper in 8-foot strips has been beaten lengthwise down the center at right angles and lies ready to edge the coping. One still chewing picks up a copper strip and runs his eye along it. That's awfully similar in my mind to it was no dream of the gift of idle hours or easy gold at the hand of fay or elf. What was it that the scythe whispered? It was no dream of the gift of idle hours or easy gold at the hand of fay or elf. I suppose they had decades behind them of Swinburne. When they were writing, who was the most popular poet in America? Who was the most popular poet in American history? Robinson, not close, though he did sell a lot of copies of those narrative poems. Whitman, not close at all. The poet I'm thinking of sold 1 million copies of a book, 1 million copies of a book of poems in the 1920s, when 1 million copies meant something. Emerson, Cummings, Whittier are all good guesses. This poet had his own radio show. He wrote a daily column with a poem every day. I could say it again? A little louder? Not Robinson. The poet's name was Edgar Guest. The book, It Takes a Heap of Living, with It Takes a Heap of Living to Make a House of Home, did sell 1 million copies. And I suppose that somewhere in the back of the mind of Frost, in the back of the mind of Williams, in bringing out the struggle in the subject of love, and the struggle in work, and in trying to make a music in which speech and form had a mysterious Apache dance they were doing together. They weren't coinciding in a way that was reassuring. It was about mystery. I suppose it's what we mean by modernism. And in their own way, they were both trying to say that they thirsted for something more disturbing, more mysterious, more beautiful, more complicated, more difficult, less complacent than that. To waken an old lady. Old age is a flight of small cheeping birds skimming bare trees above a snow glaze. Gaining and failing, they are buffeted by a dark wind. But what? On harsh weed stalks the flock has rested. The snow is covered with broken seed husks, and the wind tempered by a shrill piping of plenty. I talked with Jim Tolan's wonderful students right before coming in here, and we talked about, in the Frost poem I'm about to read, about the rhyme of was and eyes, the rhyme of eyes and gaze. And Williams uses that same voiced S, Z sound in this poem. Old age is a flight, old age, Old age is a flight of small cheeping birds skimming bare trees above a snow glaze. And trees glaze ends the poem with something, a kind of a rhyme. It ends that sentence, I'm sorry, not poem. It ends the sentence. Old age is a flight of small cheeping birds skimming bare trees above a snow glaze. Gaining and failing, they are buffeted by a dark wind. And that sort of spondaic movement of dark wind, for me it echoes and answers old age at the beginning. Old age is a flight of slow then fast. Old age is a flight of small cheeping birds skimming bare trees above a snow glaze. Participle gerund. Old age is a flight of small cheeping birds skimming bare trees above a snow glaze. Gaining and failing, they are buffeted by a dark wind. Old age, dark wind. But what? On harsh weed stalks, the flock has rested. The snow is covered with broken seed husks. He's so aware of the concept. Is covered with broken seed husks, and the wind tempered by a shrill piping of plenty. And the wind tempered by a shrill piping of plenty. And it's as though the old lady's consciousness is the birds. It's fragmented. It's gaining and failing, buffeted by a dark wind. And then she wakes up, but what? On harsh weed stalks the flock has rested. The snow is covered with broken seed husks, and the wind tempered by a shrill piping of plenty. To me, this is not a poem about old age in the least. It's a poem about consciousness, which is always partial. You never know everything. You never even remember everything you have experienced. You're never all of yourself. But when you wake up, there is a shrill piping of plenty. It is like when the birds settle on a place where there's seed husks in the winter. It's a poem more about that moment of focusing of consciousness. And the old lady is a convenient way to express that. I think the same is exactly true of this, I think, one of Frost's greatest poems. I have it here partly because it officially also is not a poem in rhyme. It's in blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter. But listen to it. An old man's winter night. All out of doors look darkly in at him through the thin frost, almost in separate stars, that gathers on the pane in empty rooms. What kept his eyes from giving back the gaze was the lamp tilted near them in his hand. What kept him from remembering what it was that brought him to that creaking room was age. He stood with barrels round him, at a loss. And having scared the cellar under him in clumping here, he scared it once again in clumping off, and scared the outer night, which has its sounds, familiar, like the roar of trees and crack of branches, common things, but nothing so like beating on a box. A light he was to no one but himself, where now he sat, concerned with he knew what, a quiet light, and then not even that. He consigned to the moon, such as she was, so later rising to the broken moon, as better than the sun in any case for such a charge. His snow upon the roof, his icicles along the wall to keep, and slept. The log that shifted with a jolt once in the stove disturbed him, and he shifted and eased his heavy breathing, but still slept. One aged man, one man, can't keep a house, a farm, a countryside, or if he can, it's thus he does it of a winter's night. And the snow along the roof, the icicles along the walls that he consigns to the moon, has to do with the mystery of you go to sleep or you're unconscious, you wake up, there you are. Where was it? And it's also the infinity and the definition of that place where the man is conscious. And consciousness is partial like his gaze. What kept his eyes from giving back the gaze was the lamp tilted near them in his hand. What kept him from remembering what it was that brought him to that creaking room was age. Must have wanted an apple, I guess. He stood with barrels round him at a loss. To point out the similarity with Williams, and partly in my mind was that the supporters of Frost and Williams often want to say the other is not. And listen to the dentals in this sentence. Dentals are, you know, when your tongue hits the top of your, behind your teeth. If you're from New Jersey, I guess it stays there longer. A light he was to no one but himself, where now he sat. A light he was to no one but himself, where now he sat, concerned with he knew what. A quiet light, and then not even that. A light he was to no one but himself, where now he sat. A quiet light, concerned with he knew what. A quiet light, and then not even that. To hear the way he, at every pause, he hits the T, to me that is a more important formal perception than figuring out how to write a sestine or a villanelle and a certain pattern of the lines, words at the ends of the lines. Because it's happening every second. Every single syllable is part of that matrix of expressive sounds. And again, in both of them, in both poems, consciousness is partial. It strains, gaining and failing in a dark, they're buffeted by a dark wind. But what? But what? It's immediate rather than oratorical in both cases. It's strained rather than comfortable and complacent in both cases. It's mysterious and difficult rather than accessible and jovial in both cases. And it's deeply expressive, in my opinion, of their desire to make something beautiful in American culture, out of American speech and American vocabulary, and a sense of the strain involved in that. Their desire to improve American culture and society is associated, in my opinion, with their sense that the anti-intellectual in the context of American life is always repressive and reactionary. There may be a moment at which it pretends to be populist or genial, but in the end it is always repressive in our country. The anti-intellectual is always reactionary, to use a different kind of old-fashioned word. My evidence for that assertion is partly in the last two poems that I'll read to you, the most ambitious of the pairs of poems. I have a feeling that likely that Williams is more familiar. I'll read it first. It's always printed with the title To Elsie, though in fact To Elsie is not the title Frost gave it, it's just an untitled section, Williams gave it. It's an untitled section of this sequence of prose and verse mixed called Spring and All. But we always call it To Elsie. To Elsie. The pure products of America go crazy. Mountain folk from Kentucky or the ribbed north end of Jersey, with its isolate lakes and valleys, its deaf mutes, thieves, old names and promiscuity, between devil-may-care men who have taken to railroading out of sheer lust of adventure, and young slatterns, bathed in filth from Monday to Saturday, to be tricked out that night with gauds from imaginations which have no peasant traditions to give them character, but flutter and flaunt sheer rags, succumbing without emotion save numbed terror under some hedge of choke cherry or viburnum, which they cannot express, unless it be that marriage, perhaps with a dash of Indian blood, will throw up a girl so desolate, so hemmed round with disease or murder, that she'll be rescued by an agent, reared by the state, and sent out at 15 to work in some hard-pressed house in the suburbs, some doctor's family, some Elsie. Voluptuous water expressing with broken brain the truth about us. her great ungainly hips and flopping breasts addressed to cheap jewelry and rich young men with fine eyes, as if the earth under our feet were an excrement of some sky, and we degraded prisoners destined to hunger until we eat filth, while the imagination strains after deer going by fields of goldenrod in the stifling heat of September. Somehow, it seems to destroy us. It is only an isolate flex that something is given off. No one to witness and adjust. No one to drive the car. I love the poem's relation to social class. It's so candid and unpretentious, the way he makes it come down that apex to some hard-pressed house in the suburbs, some doctor's family, some Elsie, and then the terrifically unsentimental portrait of Elsie herself. And the way it harks back to that question about the project, democratic project, whatever you want to call it, of the imaginations which have no peasant traditions to give them character. Imaginations which have no peasant traditions to give them character. It's uneasy. It's mysterious, even bewildered. It's dire, and it's so musical. I mean, it's practically in rhyme. Pure products of America go crazy. Mountain folk from Kentucky, or the rib north end of Jersey, with its isolate lakes and valleys. Its deaf mutes these old names and promiscuity between devil-may-care. It's syncopated. It's not ta-da, da-da, 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 da-da. Nothing against ta-da, da-da, 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 da-da. But it's supremely musical. And for me, it's the excitement and thrill of making music out of that direness, mystery, uneasiness, candor. And he's invented a music for it. The instrument is there. It's not that it's perfectly comfortable. And he's using it, and he gives us the instrument of his poem that we can give voice to. I associate the poem with this poem by Robert Frost. I'll read it, and I'll say about 3 or 4 sentences, and then it'll be time for questions or gentle remarks. Directive. Directive. Back out of all this now too much for us. Back in a time made simple by the loss of detail, burned, dissolved, and broken off like graveyard marble sculpture in the weather. There's a house that is no more a house upon a farm that is no more a farm, and in a town that is no more a town. The road there, if you'll let a guide direct you who only has at heart you're getting lost, may seem as if it should have been a quarry. Great monolithic knees the former town long since gave up pretense of keeping covered. And there's a story in a book about it. Besides the wear of iron wagon wheels, the ledge shows lines ruled southeast, northwest, the chisel work of an enormous glacier that braced his feet against the Arctic pole. You must not mind a certain coolness from him, still said to haunt this side of Panther Mountain. Nor need you mind the serial ordeal of being watched from 40 cellar holes as if by eye pairs out of 40 firkins. As for the wood's excitement over you, that sends light rustle rushes to their leaves, charge that to upstart inexperience. What were they all not 20 years ago? They think too much of having shaded out a few old pecker-fretted apple trees. I'll interrupt. You get the idea that in New England, every year, many, many acres go over to forest or farmland. And in the middle of the woods, you find walls. They're not walls put up there to keep anything in or out. They're made when somebody clears stones from frost heaves from their farm. So you're walking in the woods. Somebody once worked very hard on that land. And sometimes there's a village. Cellar holes also overgrown by upstart woods. Make yourself up a cheering song of how someone's home. Make yourself up a cheering song of how someone's road home from work this once was, who may be just ahead of you on foot or creaking with a buggy load of grain. The height of the adventure is the height of country, where two village cultures faded into each other. Both of them are lost. And if you're lost enough to find yourself by now, pull in your ladder road behind you and put a sign up, closed to all but me. Then make yourself at home. The only field now left's no bigger than a harness gall. First, there's the children's house of make-believe, some shattered dishes underneath a pine, the playthings in the playhouse of the children. Weep for what little things could make them glad. Then for the house that is no more a house, but only a belilaced cellar hole, now slowly closing like a dent in dough. This was no playhouse, but a house in earnest. Your destination and your destinies, a brook that was the water of the house, cold as a spring as yet so near its source, too lofty and original to rage. We know the valley streams that when aroused will leave their tatters hung on barb and thorn. I have kept hidden in the instep arch of an old cedar at the waterside a broken drinking goblet, like the Grail, under a spell, so the wrong ones can't find it, so can't get saved, as St. Mark says they mustn't. I stole the goblet from the children's playhouse. Here are your waters and your watering place. Drink and be whole again, beyond confusion. When he says, then make yourself at home, I feel an irony and an ardor both about the question that remind me of William saying, no peasant traditions to give them character. These village cultures rose and faded and the woods came up, and it's all still very near its source. Both poems, in a way, are about American forgetting. We are not all of one religion, we're not all of one race, we're not all of one ethnicity. Presumably we're held together by consciousness, ideas, some sense of what Americans are, and that's what we make our home out of. Great national documents, cultural phenomena, Buster Keaton, Langston Hughes, James Madison, whatever you think it is. And it's an open question in both poems to get back to the source and say, here, now I'm at home. This is what I need from the past. And my allegory of the instrument and the voice is meant also to reflect on that. The lyric, which is always a dissatisfied form. You couldn't have lyric poetry without saying the lady is cruel, or I'm suffering, or I'm burning. Certainly couldn't have elegies without saying, oh, I wish I didn't feel this grief. And the lyric, in that sense, inherently is an uncomfortable form. It's a form that has an irritant that spurs it to song. And the context of American culture, it's engaged in a tremendous struggle or argument with the anti-intellectual, with the forgetful, the savage, and yet it also wants to be loyal to those ideas of the new. And to me, each of the poets in their own way devised gorgeous, inspiring, worth emulating and aspiring to formal solutions for that agon, really, for that struggle. Thanks very much.